The gymnasium was hot with the breath of 200 people who had come to beg, and every one of them was looking at the woman by the folding table near the north wall. She was not tall. Her coat was patched at both elbows with a thread that did not match, and her hands, when she folded them on the table, showed the shine of old blisters gone to callus. Outside, the ice storm had shut the roads for the fourth day running, and the power had been out across the whole of the county since Tuesday, and the great refrigerated warehouses that fed the grocery chains had gone dark and warm, and the eggs in them had spoiled by the pallet. But here, in this cold room lit by a rope of gasoline lanterns, there was a woman who had eggs, thousands of them, and a man in a good wool coat stood at the front with a checkbook already open. And he was smiling the smile of a man who believes the ending has been written in his favor, and everyone waited to hear what the woman would say. She let the silence run long. She had learned the worth of a silence, and though not a soul in that room would have believed it 2 years before, the truth was that the verdict on Marguerite Vance had already been handed down, long ago, by a half-frozen bird she had pulled out of a pond with her own 2 hands, and the rest of it was only the world catching up to what the water already knew. Rewind, then, to a raw morning in late March, 2 winters gone. Marguerite came to the valley alone, which is the first thing anyone remembers about her, because a woman alone was a thing the town of Holloway did not quite know where to file. She was 41 years old, and had spent 19 of those years keeping the books for a farm supply cooperative 3 states east, and when the cooperative was bought and gutted and her desk carried out to the parking lot, she had taken the whole of her severance and her savings, $86,000. And she had bought the one thing in the valley nobody else would touch. The old Pruitt place, 40 acres of low soggy ground that flooded every spring and grew nothing a man could sell, wrapped around a shallow spring-fed pond, the color of weak tea. It came with a leaning barn, a house that leaned the other way as if to disagree with it, and a flock of geese. Not a fine flock. A ragged, ill-tempered, mud-colored flock of some forgotten heritage breed, 63 birds all told, that the bank had listed on the inventory sheet as livestock, negligible value. She paid $71,000 for the land and the buildings and the birds together, which left her $15,000 to live on and to lose, and every practical soul in 3 counties agreed she had thrown her whole life into a hole in the ground and pulled the dirt in after her. The man in the good wool coat was there from the very first week, though he did not wear that particular coat yet. His name was Delvin Roach, and he was the acquisitions agent for Cardinal Vale Provisions, a consortium that owned 4 vast layer operations along the interstate, each of them a windowless steel building holding 120,000 caged hens, each building humming day and night like a thing that could not sleep. Cardinal Vale had been quietly buying up the small holdings along the creek bottom for 2 years, meaning to drain the whole watershed and put up a 5th building. The Pruitt place, with its spring and its low ground, sat square in the middle of the parcel they wanted, and so Delvin Roach came to Marguerite's crooked porch with a leather folder and a warmth in his voice as smooth as buttered bread. He offered her $74,000 to walk away, which was $3,000 more than she had paid, and he called it a kindness. He said a woman alone couldn't be expected to work ground like this. He said the geese were worthless, that the breed didn't lay well, didn't dress out heavy, that folks wanted white eggs from white leghorns and nobody in living memory had paid good money for a goose egg. He said all this leaning against her porch rail with his ankles crossed, and Marguerite listened to the whole of it with her hands in her coat pockets, and then she said, quiet as a closing door, I believe I'll keep them a while. Roach smiled, because he was a patient man, and he had seen the ground beat harder people than her, and he left his card wedged in the doorframe where the wind took it that same night. The town's verdict came at the feed store the following Saturday. Marguerite went in for cracked corn and layer pellets, doing the arithmetic in her head the way she always did, and the arithmetic that spring was a grim little sum that ran the same every night before she slept. $15,000 in the bank, 63 geese eating their heads off, not a single egg yet sold, and the season for it barely begun. Divide the money by the months, and you got a countdown?" And the countdown said she had perhaps 14 months before the sum reached zero, and the bank took back what it had so gladly sold. At the feed store, the men by the stove looked her over, and one of them, a big red-faced dairyman named Orrin Kessler, who owned the best-drained 160 acres on the ridge and was not shy about mentioning it, laughed out loud when the clerk told him what she'd bought. "Priett's swamp, and Priett's swamp chickens," Orrin said, loud enough for the whole store. "There's a woman paid full price for a lesson the rest of us got free." The men laughed with him because it was easier than not, and Marguerite paid for her feed and carried it out to her truck herself, 40-pound sacks 2 at a time, and if her face was hot, she did not let them see it. Being laughed at, she was learning was its own kind of weather. You could not argue with it. You could only outlast it. The first labor of that place nearly broke her. The barn roof leaked in 9 spots, and she patched them one by one on a borrowed ladder in the rain. The fences were down and the geese wandered, and she walked the property line at dusk, driving them in. 63 birds that hissed and bit and beat her shins with their wings, and would not be herded like sheep or driven like cattle, but only, she found, coaxed if you moved slow and let them believe the going in was their own idea. She hauled the mucked straw by the wheelbarrow load. She mended the pond bank where the runoff had cut it, and every night she sat at the crooked kitchen table with a ledger and a stub of pencil and worked the sum, and every night the sum was worse, because the geese in that cold, wet spring were not laying at all, and a flock that does not lay is only 63 mouths and no return, and she began along about the 3rd week of April. To think she had been a fool of the exact and complete kind, Orrin Kessler said she was. It was on the worst of those nights that the thing happened that turned the whole story on its hinge, though she did not know it then. A late ice storm came through, the kind that coats the world in glass, and in the gray of the next morning she went out to break the ice on the pond edge so the flock could drink, and she found one of them in trouble. A young goose, hatched late the fall before, half-grown and gray, had gone out onto the thin ice in the night, and broken through, and could not climb back, and it hung there in the black water, with only its head and one wing above the surface, too spent even to cry out, its eyes gone dull. The others stood on the bank and watched it die the way animals do, without cruelty and without mercy. And Marguerite did not stop to think. She waded out to her waist in water so cold it drove the breath from her chest, and she got her arms under that bird and lifted it, a sodden gray weight gone nearly limp, and carried it up the bank and inside, and laid it on the open door of the wood stove's warming oven, wrapped in a flannel shirt. For an hour it did not move, and she was sure it was gone. Then one webbed foot stirred. Then the yellow film cleared from its eye. And when at last it lifted its head and looked at her with the flat, unbothered gaze that geese give the world, she found she was crying, and could not have told you whether it was for the bird or for herself, or whether by then there was much difference between the two. She named it ash, for the gray of it, and for the coal. She was, without knowing the word yet, banking against the cold. Ash lived, and something in Marguerite's chest that had been folding shut came open again, and the next morning she went back to the sum with the stubbornness she had not had before. If the flock would not lay in the cold wet, then she would learn why, and she would learn what would change it, and she would not sit and watch her money drain out like water through the Pruitt bottom. She began to watch the geese the way she had once watched columns of figures, looking for the pattern under the noise. And it was in the middle of that watching, on a still evening in early May, that the elder came up her lane. The elder was a woman named Ilse Bergfist, who had come to the valley from the far north country as a girl of 9, some 60 years before, and had kept geese on the next ridge over her whole life, and whom the town regarded with a wariness that was almost respect, because she was old and strange and had buried 2 husbands and outlasted every man who ever tried to tell her how to farm. She came walking up the lane with a hazel stick in her hand, and she did not laugh, which by then was so rare that Marguerite noticed it the way you notice a sound stopping. Ilse stood at the pond bank a long while, and watched the flock come off the water in the blue dusk, and then she said in the soft, careful English of one who has spoken it long but was not born to it, "You have been trying to keep them like hens." Marguerite said she supposed she had. Ilse nodded. "A hen is a thing you own," she said. "A goose is a thing you keep company with. The land here, this wet ground, everyone despises. It is not poor. It is only telling you what it wants to grow. And it is not corn." She walked the bank with her stick, pointing, "Grass, grass and water, and grazing, and space, and geese that walk their own miles. Feed them pellets in a pen, and you will get a sick bird and no eggs. Let them out onto the wet meadow where the grass comes up green off the flood, and let the water be their own, and they will lay you eggs so rich the yolks stand up like small suns." She turned and fixed Marguerite with a pale eye. "The land remembers what the farmer is always forgetting, but it will not shout it at you, it only whispers. So you must go quiet enough to hear." She left the aphorism sitting in the dusk, and she left one more thing besides. A practical key that changed the whole shape of the problem. She told Marguerite the breed she owned by its old name, a heavy grazing goose, brought over by settlers from Ilse's own home country 150 years before, and near lost now prized in the old world, not for meat, but for eggs, of a size and richness no chicken could match. Eggs that pastry cooks and bakers had once paid dearly for, and would again if any of them knew such a thing still existed. "You did not buy swamp chickens," Ilse said at the gate, and something almost like a smile moved in the deep lines of her face. "You bought your grandmother's flock, and nobody in that town is old enough to know what they were looking at." Then she went off down the lane in the dark, tapping her stick, and Marguerite stood a long time at the gate turning the whole world over in her mind. She stopped fighting the ground after that. She took down the pen fence entirely and let the flock have the run of the wet meadow, and she stopped pouring money into pellets and let them graze the green flush of grass that came up thick off the spring flood, grass that grew nowhere else in the valley precisely because nowhere else in the valley flooded the way the despised Pruitt bottom did. She moved slow among them and learned them one from another until she knew every bird by its walk and its voice, the 63 of them, an ash chief among them now grown into a great gray gander of uncommon calm, who would come at her low whistle and stand by her boot while she worked. And the land given leave to do what its nature intended began quietly to answer. In the second week of that experiment, she found the first egg, huge and pale and warm, in a nest of pressed grass by the water, and she held it in both hands like it was made of something more than shell. By the end of May, she was gathering a dozen a day. By June, 3 dozen, and each one, when she cracked it into the pan, showed a yolk the deep orange of a sunset, standing tall and proud, the way Ilse had said. She told no one. This was the coal she banked, low and covered, giving off no smoke to draw the eye. She went on being pitied. When she passed Orrin Kessler on the road, he still grinned and shook his head, and she let him, because a secret kept is worth more than a secret spent, and the arithmetic in her ledger had begun for the first time to turn the other way. Around this time a boy took to appearing at her fence line. His name was Tobias Renner, and he was 10 years old, and the son of a family down the creek that had more mouths than money, and he never said much. He would just be there, watching. And after a while he was inside the fence, and after a while longer he was helping, gathering eggs into a basket, with a care beyond his years. And it was Tobias who gave the geese their names, all 63, working them out over weeks by the marks and the temperaments only a watchful child would trouble to see. "That one's Duchess, 'cause she thinks she owns the pond," he'd say, dead serious. "And that one's Trouble. And you know why? He never once said the flock was worthless." He looked at what Marguerite was building, and he saw, with the clean, uncorrupted sight of a child, that it made sense, and on the long, lonely days, his small, steady presence was worth more to her than she could have told him. The first true vindication came from outside the valley, as such things do, because the valley itself was too busy laughing to look. In July, a man drove up her lane in a van with the name of a city restaurant painted on the door, sent by a rumor of a rumor, a chef named Aurelio, who had heard from a supplier who had heard from a farmer's market vendor that there was a woman out past Holloway with goose eggs, the like of which had not been seen in the country in 50 years. He cracked one open right there on her tailgate, and looked at the yolk standing up in the pan, and went very quiet, the way a man goes quiet in a church. "Do you know what these are worth?" he said, and it was not a question. He bought every egg she had that day, and every egg she could produce for a month. Besides, had he paid her $4 an egg, a price so far past the 80 cents a chicken egg fetched that Marguerite had to sit down on the tailgate herself. Being right, she thought, watching his van dwindle down the lane with her eggs packed, careful in straw, was its own kind of reply. She did not need to say a word to Orrin Kessler or to Delvin Roach. The land had said it for her. But being right is a thing that draws predators as surely as it draws praise. And Delvin Roach had not stopped watching. He came back in August in the Goodwill coat, and this time the warmth in his voice had a thin, cold thread running under it. Word of the chef had reached him, because word reaches men like him first. He sat on her porch and made a new offer, $110,000 now. And he called it generous. And when she declined it, plainly he made a third within the fortnight, $140. And behind the number this time came the shape of a threat, spoken the way such men speak threats, wrapped in concern. He mentioned that the county was reviewing water rights along the creek. Clacks? He mentioned that a spring-fed pond drawing down the shared aquifer might come under scrutiny, that a woman alone might find the permits difficult, the lawyers expensive. He mentioned that Cardinal Vale had friends on the zoning board. He said all of it smiling, and Marguerite listened to all of it with her hands in her pockets, and when he was finished she said only, "I believe I'll keep them a while yet." The same words as the first day. And she watched the smile tighten on his face like a knot pulled hard. The pressure came in 3 tightening waves after that, the way such pressure does. First the rumor seeded through the valley by mouths that owed Cardinal Vale money, that Marguerite's eggs were unsafe, that geese carried disease, that the health department would be shutting her down. Then the civic squeeze, a certified letter from the county questioning her water use and demanding a survey she could ill afford. A letter she came to understand had been prompted by a complaint filed by a shell company, whose address, when she dug for it with the patience of a woman who had kept books for 19 years, traced back through 3 cutouts to Cardinal Vale provisions. And then the outright offer to swallow her whole, delivered by Roach in person, that Cardinal Vale would buy her flock and her land and put her name on nothing, would take the breed and the eggs and the whole quiet miracle and fold it into their brand and sell it at $10 an egg to the very cities that were beginning to ask for it, and would pay her $180,000 to disappear and sign a paper promising never to keep a goose again. It was, by any cold arithmetic, more money than she had ever imagined holding. She sat with the paper a long night at the crooked table, with Ash asleep on the porch and the pencil in her hand, and she did not sign it. And in the morning she drove to Ilse Bergquist's ridge and asked her plainly whether she was a fool. "Ooh." The old woman poured coffee and thought a long while, and then said, "A coal you sell for money warms one house for one night. A coal you keep and tend and share, it can light a whole valley, but only if the valley ever gets cold enough to need it." She looked out the window at the dry August sky, cloudless and hard. "And it will," she said. "The ground is thirsty. I can feel it in my knees. And it always comes, the cold or the drought or the storm. The only question is, who has kept a coal? What came was not drought. What came that following winter was the ice. It began the week before the reckoning, a storm out of the northwest that laid an inch of glass over every road, and wire and branch in 3 counties, and then another storm on its heels, and then the deep cold behind them both, and the power lines came down under the weight of the ice one after another until the whole grid went dark, and in the dark the great steel buildings of Cardinal Vale Provisions, 4 of them, each holding 120,000 caged hens, went silent because a caged layer operation is a machine, and a machine without power is a tomb. The heaters failed, the automatic feeders stopped. The ventilation fans that those hundreds of thousands of birds depended on for the very air stood still, and within 2 days the losses were catastrophic beyond anything Roach's consortium had planned for, and the eggs already laid, stored in vast refrigerated rooms, warmed and turned and spoiled by the tens of thousands of dozens. The grocery chains of 3 counties emptied of eggs in a day and did not refill, because the roads were glass and the warehouses were dark, and every industrial flock for 100 miles was dying in the cold. But out on the despised Proet Bottom, the geese did not so much as ruffle. They were a heavy northern breed bred for a hard country, and they had walked their own miles all their lives, and the cold that killed the caged hens by the 100,000 was only weather to them. They pushed through the ice on the pond with their own bodies, as they had always done. They grazed the frozen meadow and took the feed Marguerite carried out on foot, sack by sack, across the glazed ground. And they went right on laying, warm and pale and rich, into their nests of pressed grass, 63 birds grown now, to 240 over 2 seasons of careful breeding. And in the dark, cold heart of that catastrophe, Marguerite Vance had the one thing 3 counties suddenly and desperately needed, and could not get anywhere else at any price. She had eggs. They came to her then, the ones who had laughed. Orrin Kessler came first, and this was the humbled beggar of the whole long tale, the loud man brought low. His dairy herd was in crisis, his own generator failed, his family had not had fresh food in a week, and he stood on Marguerite's crooked porch turning his cap in his big red hands, and he could not at first even meet her eye. He had cash, some, but not $4 an egg, not near it, and he had come to ask what he had no right to ask, and the shame of it was written all over him. Here was the moral choice laid bare. The door swung open. She could name any price, and he, and all the valley would pay it, would empty their pockets to feed their children, and no one could have called it wrong. Marguerite looked at Orrin Kessler a long moment, the man who had christened her flock swamp chickens, in front of the whole feed store, and then she said, "You come tomorrow to the school gymnasium, bring anyone who's hungry. We'll settle it there all together." And Orrin, who had expected to be gouged, or turned away, put his cap back on and went down the lane, not understanding, but hoping. Which brings us back at last to that hot, crowded gymnasium, and to Delvin Roach standing at the front with his checkbook already open. For he had come too, of course. He had come because he understood, better than any of them, exactly what Marguerite now held. His 4 buildings were graves. His brand was ruined for the season, and perhaps for good. And the only living flock of laying birds in 3 counties, the only source of eggs for these 200 hungry people, belonged to the woman he had tried 3 times to buy and once to break. So he had come to buy her out at the moment of her greatest leverage and his greatest need, and he stood before the crowd and made his play in that buttered voice offering. He announced grandly to purchase Marguerite Vance's entire egg production for the duration of the emergency and distribute it to the community at a fair price. Through the trusted brand of Cardinal Vale Provisions, and all the frightened, hungry people turned to look at him with the beginning of relief, because he was a man in a good coat who sounded like he was in charge. And it was there that Delvin Roach undid himself with his own tongue, the way such men always do. Puffed with the crowd's attention, he pressed his advantage and turned to Marguerite and said warmly that he was prepared to buy her whole current stock, on the spot, all 4,200 eggs of it, at $1 apiece, cash today. And in the sudden hush, Marguerite let a small silence fall, and then she said, mild as milk. Now that's a strange thing, Mr. Roach. She looked out at the crowd. I counted my stock myself at 5 o'clock this morning by lantern light. 4,211. I never told a living soul the number. She let that sit. So how is it you know within 11 eggs what I've got in my barn, unless you've had a man out watching my property in the dark? The color went out of Roach's face all at once, because there was no answer that was not a confession. And the crowd began, low at first and then rising, to murmur, and every eye in that room turned from the man in the good wool coat to the woman in the patched one. And the whole weight of the thing shifted in an instant, the way weight does after long balance. Then Marguerite stood and she spoke to the room, not to Roach, and she said what she had driven home the night before, knowing she would say. She would not sell her eggs to Cardinal Vale for $1 or $10 or any price, not one egg, because Cardinal Vale would turn a valley's hunger into a season's profit, and she had no stomach for it. But neither, she said, would she gouge her neighbors, the ones who had laughed and the ones who had not, all the same now in their need. She would give the eggs to any family in that room that wanted them, as many as they had children to feed, and she asked in return only this, that able hands come out to the Pruett bottom in the mornings and help her carry feed and mend fence and keep the flock through the ice. Because 240 geese were more than one woman could tend alone in a hard winter. And she was, she said, with the ghost of a smile, still only a woman alone. I'm not charging you for the eggs, she said. The eggs, the land. Made the land don't send a bill. I'm only asking you to help me keep the flock that makes them, and that seems to me a fair enough trade among neighbors. The reversal came all at once, and it came in silence before it came in sound. Orrin Kessler was the first to move. He stepped up from the crowd, and he took off his cap, and he held it against his chest, and in a voice gone rough, he said, loud enough for all of them, I called your birds swamp chickens in front of every man in Halloway. And your swamp chickens are the only thing in this county keeping my children fed. I was a fool, ma'am, and I'll be at your fence tomorrow at first light, and every day after that you'll have me. Then he turned to the crowd, and there was nothing in his face but plain shame turned to plain resolve. And one by one, all through that gymnasium, the men took off their hats. Delvin Roach stood forgotten at the front, with his checkbook open to a page nobody would ever let him fill. And after a moment he closed it and gathered his good coat around him and walked out into the ice alone. And Cardinal Vale Provisions, its buildings ruined, and its name blackened, and its schemes laid bare, never again sent a man up the Pruett Lane. He was beaten in the end by nothing more forceful than a woman's decency, which is the only weapon such men have no defense against. The ice broke in the second week, as ice does, and the thaw came, and the water ran off the Pruett bottom into the pond, and the pond ran clear, and the grass, when spring came around again, flushed up green off the flood thicker than ever, and the valley did not forget. All that hard winter, the hands came out at first light, Orrin, Kessler, and a dozen others, and they mended the fence and carried the feed, and learned, some of them, to move slow among the great gray birds, and to hear what the wet ground had been trying to tell them all along. The flock grew. Water ran up and down the interstate that the only heritage goose-egg operation in the region, the one that had fed 3 counties through the ice while the caged giants died in the dark, was taking on more birds and more ground, and the chefs came in a steady stream now, and the price held. And the arithmetic in Marguerite's ledger ran so far the right way that she stopped at last doing the countdown at night because there was nothing left to count down to. She hired Tobias Renner's father, and half the Renner family besides, and the boy, who had named all 63 of the original flock, grew into the young man who kept the breeding records, and could still tell you, if you asked, exactly which of the 2,000 birds on the place now traced back in a straight line to the great calm gander named Ash, who lived to a remarkable age, and died in his sleep in the sun on the pond bank, and was buried there, and whom Marguerite never once, in all her years, spoke of without her voice going soft. Ilsa Bergfist came up the lane one last spring evening, older and slower, tapping her hazel stick, and she stood at the pond and watched the flock come off the water in the blue dusk, hundreds of them now, and she watched the neighbors working easy among them. And she watched a woman who had come to the valley alone and unwanted, move through the middle of it all as its plain, unquestioned center. She did not say much. She never did. But at the gate going, she paused and put her old hand over Marguerite's on the wood, and she said, "You heard it. The whispering most never do." And Marguerite, watching a late gosling half the size of her boot, tottered down toward the bright water where its whole gray flock had turned to look at it come, found she could not answer, and only stood and listened, the way the old woman had taught her, to the land telling everyone at last what the water had known from the very first cold morning. That nothing on this earth is worthless but for the eyes too proud to see it, and that a coal kept low and tended long will, when the world grows cold enough, warm a whole valley through.
Voilà, c'est la maman de Jenny qui m'a fait ce joli bavoir. Il est énorme, les gars, il est énorme. Je peux plus me tâcher. Il est brodé et il y a marqué Suki et c'est Sue Kids. Est-ce que c'est pas trop mignon? C'est trop mignon. Il est trop beau, franchement, elle a trop, trop bien bossé. Regarde, tu un copain! Vous imaginez pas comme ça m'a touchée, hein. C'est très, très joli, hein. Ouais, bravo, vraiment bravo. Alors bravo à la maman de Jenny et merci encore Jenny parce que